Thank you, Sheldon. You and Natasha have certainly brought us to a beautiful city and a beautiful venue for the conference, and I'm really excited to see everyone here. I'll be introducing our keynote speaker, and there's sort of two challenges to introducing this speaker, Andy Van Dam. The first is that just listing Andy's qualifications would be a second keynote this morning, and probably less interesting than the one he's going to give, so I'm going to try and do that quickly. But the second is that I'm going to give you a brief version of that list of honors, but that's going to sort of obscure the most important thing, which is the man in front of you, not this man, that man. He's a fantastic and humble researcher, teacher. He's been a mentor to me as well as many generations of students who passed through Brown. And Andy began as a failed undergraduate physics major. This was his second choice, was being one of the founders of our graphics community. But he did an okay job at that, and I think we all appreciate that very much. So thank you, Andy. And that is, I'm super pleased to tell you that this secondary choice of career as a teacher has recently paid off. He is going to become this summer the first recipient of a new ACM SIGGRAPH Award for Distinguished Educator for Outstanding Pedagogical Contributions to Computer Graphics and Interactive Techniques. So congratulations for that, Andy.
Thank you. Thank you.
I think this is a field with no shortage of truly outstanding teachers, some of whom are in this room with us today. And I can't think of anyone who deserves to be the first recipient more than yourself. So along the way between taking his first physics class and deciding maybe engineering instead and becoming one of the greatest teachers in our field, he did keep busy. So he's authored or co-authored over 100 papers, 9 books, including Fundamentals of Interactive Computer Graphics, and 3 editions of Computer Graphics Principles and Practice, which at Brown we like to call Foley et al. He's a fellow of the ACM, IEEE, and AAAS. He's a member of the SIGGRAPH Academy, the National Academy of Engineering, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He is the Thomas J. Watson Jr. Professor of Technology and Education and Professor of Computer Science at Brown University. He has served on the Brown faculty there since 1965. He also co-founded the Computer Science Department in the Graphics Group at Brown, was the first chairman of the department, and was the university's first vice president for research at Brown. He co-founded SIGGRAPH, which was the predecessor of what we now know as SIGGRAPH. He's chaired the CRA. He received the Carl V. Karlstrom Outstanding Educator Award, the Coons Award for Outstanding Creative Contributions, and the IEEE Centennial Medal. He holds honorary doctorates from Darmstadt Technical University, Swarthmore, University of Waterloo, and ETH Zurich. And I think we also know him exceptionally for his work on computer graphics and hypermedia systems and pen computing, post-WIMP and natural user interfaces. He also chaired this very conference in 1997. He was in Providence, and he was the I3D chair. And so let's give a big hand to one of the seminal figures in our field, Andy Van Dam.
Thank you. Well, that was a really overly generous introduction, Morgan. Thank you. Bonjour, messieurs, dames. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's really delightful to be back at the conference in a beautiful city, beautiful weather. I think the organizing people did a great job with all these local arrangements. Let's see if I can get my it timed out in the meantime. I think you better do this. You know you're in a civilized country when you get fresh orange juice and escargot for breakfast. Terrific. I want to thank the folks who made it possible for me to come and talk with you. I've listed some of them here. Our sponsors, and I should have put Unity here, a great space and great hospitality on their part. Very happy. Okay, I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself, and I'm going to confess that I'm a dinosaur. I grew up not even knowing what digital computers were when I started studying them. I was going to be a hardware transistor designer, and my office mate at University of Pennsylvania said there's this new course on digital computers. Interested? I said, what are digital computers? And he said, well, come find out. So I did. And like with many of you, I bet I fell in love. Our first programming assignments were in binary, zeros and ones. We were not allowed to use the computer because it was too scarce a resource. It was a UNIVAC 1. And over time, because of my thesis work, I did get to use what was by then the IBM 7040 mainframe. One computer for the entire Penn campus, which had 20, 30,000 students. So I nearly finished my thesis before I went to Brown to start teaching there. And I wound up taking an airplane once a month with 2 boxes of this size holding that artifact. Those are called punch cards or IBM cards that contain my program. Now, think about this. I took an airplane to fly to a city 300 miles away to get a half hour on the computer as my personal computer. It's hard to imagine in an age when all of us carry multiple computers on our bodies and in our briefcases. So I've been fortunate to see the rise of modern computing, and in particular to get away from this paradigm of the punch card. And what happened was that Ivan Sutherland did this landmark demo, wrote this landmark paper, and he's really the father of computer graphics in so many ways. Computer graphics meaning interactive computer graphics, and you see someone sitting at this kind of organ-like console with all kinds of buttons and switches, holding a pointing device that lets the user draw directly on the screen and have the computer understand in some way what the intention is of the person doing the interaction. You want to make a bracket? Well, the computer can straighten it out for you, and so on. That was the notion of constraint satisfaction, which not many programs even today have. So I saw this movie and I was poleaxed. I thought, oh my God, I've been dealing with these boxes of punch cards and I have to code things, and here is somebody directly interacting with the information in a two-way visual language. It was mind-blowing. So I changed my field from information retrieval and I became hardcore interactive computer graphics. In '66, I wrote a paper about what now is called human-computer interaction, back then man-machine interaction. You'll notice that the applications that I thought were really going to be interesting at the time were online programming, IDEs today, interactive development environments, CAI, and of course, what still drives a lot of our industry, computer-aided design. So for me, it was all about the interaction. And what I'm going to do is weave 6 themes together, and they're based really on the visionaries and visions that have inspired me over the years. Now, why am I in such a looking back reflective mood? It has to do with the fact that we're celebrating the 50th anniversary of a number of momentous events, political events, the assassinations of Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy, the political revolt that led to riots at the Democratic Convention, but also incredible technological achievements like man's landing on the moon. It was a time of great tumult and turbulence and many questions about what is going to be happening to our society, both technologically and sociologically. I was in December at a celebration of the mother of all demos, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about that. And the subtext of that celebration was Engelbart's unfinished revolution. So my talk with you today is kind of along that same lines. What were these visions that inspired me? How far have we come? And how much more do we still have to do to honor those visions? And I'm using slogans that you're familiar with and people that promulgated those slogans, but I'm going to tell you where that came from historically. Some of them have roots 2,000 years old. Information at our fingertips, but not just getting information, managing and structuring that information. It's all based on what we as individuals do when we interact with computers, which is called personal computing. Computing everywhere, pervasive computing called Ubicomp by Mark Weiser, Zuck and his vision of connecting the world, and we'll see how that has worked out. And my own personal interests, primary, not exclusive, in user interfaces, interactive user interfaces. I'm going to pontificate a little bit about what I think we should want when we unite all these interrelated visions and how far we've come. Well, information at your fingertips. Bill coined it. This is one of the very rare pictures of him in a suit and tie. And notice he's talking about we want a window through the personal computer on all the world's information. More from Google's homepage, want to organize the world's information and make it universally accessible and useful. Great idea. We should definitely be doing that. Well, this idea of organizing and making information available is practically as old as writing in civilized society. And one of the wonders of the world, the great library at Alexandria, had that very same purpose. It was primarily for scholars because it wasn't for a literate population that didn't yet exist. Unfortunately, it was burned down. It was apparently a stupendously large complex. Now, I want to tell you a little bit about a pioneer that almost none of you, I bet, will have heard of. Anybody ever heard of Paul Otlet? No. So he really saw it all. He lived in a time of transition from the old-fashioned part of the Industrial Revolution to our modern age because, for example, he saw the birth of television, and he had this idea of, like the Library of Alexandria, let's organize all of the world's information, let's index it, let's cross-correlate it, let's make it accessible. And he built the information structures and the manual apparatus that let him do that in what he called the Mundaneum. Unfortunately, the Nazis destroyed it, and it has recently been rebuilt in his image, though not in the identical way, in Mons in Belgium. So what did he foresee? Look at this quote. Anyone from his armchair would be able to contemplate the whole of creation or particular parts of it. Look at the diagram. He's got the connectivity of all the devices that existed at that time, the telephone, the radio, disk storage, film, and television. And here in the bottom, you see somebody lecturing to a remote audience, and it's a little hard to deconstruct this diagram, but I think you can see these pipes. That's the internet, folks. That's the precursor of the internet. He thought of it in terms of radio. So yeah, we have a different technology now, but the fundamental ideas were all there, which is just amazing. Now, many more of you, I hope, have heard of Vannevar Bush. Show of hands? Yeah, just a few. You need to read this paper. Anybody who calls herself or himself a computer scientist must read As We May Think, because it's the vision of how we live now and certainly how we will live in the future. He was a very distinguished engineer operating from MIT, embedded in the world of microfilm. This was before digital computers in the 40s, but they had very clever mechanisms for rapidly finding information stored on microfilm via indexing schemes. So ignore the fact that his technology is not today's technology, but instead look at the vision in this landmark article. As we may think, Google it and you'll find it, and it's still a great read. I'll talk a lot more about him in just a moment. I mentioned that I came from information retrieval, and so I was very interested in this business of how do you collect information, how do you organize it, how do you distribute it, and I did my master's thesis on this particular artifact. Anybody know what this is called? Can you guess what it is? It's microfiche, right? That's the little bit of microfiche. So it's a punched card with 80 columns of digital information and then microfiche storage of analog information at pretty high density. So you could do Boolean keyword retrievals, and I wrote a thesis on how this tremendously large blueprint repository that the Navy had could do a better job storing its design blueprints and retrieving them. And I put all my hopes on this thing on the right-hand side, which was not just microfilm, it was kind of ultra microfilm because it was grainless, photochromic microimaging, it was called by NCR. And those of you who, like me, have transition lenses are using photochromic technology. It's grainless, that's what makes it so beautiful. So I thought this little King James Bible, 1,200 some pages on a piece of film this big, that's the world of the future. That's the only way in which we're going to be able to store this humongous amount of information. Didn't foresee the rise of magnetic media and other things. So I got the technology wrong, but the idea of being able to get at just stupendous amounts of information through proper indexing and search already was available at that time. So it's not just about raw information, it's about how we organize it. And I want to show you that we have precedents in the world of books before any modern technology with things like annotations and multimedia presentations. Talmuds, which were threaded discussions, if you like, of the sages interpreting particular verses and particular legal rulings in the Jewish system, started publishing these Talmuds, and you can see there's threaded discussion with annotations in the margins, even diagram. It is a multimedia document. And here, just a couple of weeks ago, I had a family vacation and in Morocco, went to Marrakesh, went to a museum and saw this amazing book behind glass, asked my guide to explain what it was, and he said, it's a hadith and it's a annotated commentary on the Quran using color and margin notes and so on. And I thought, yep, it's absolutely identical to the Talmud and to the King James Bible in that notion of being able to have threaded discussions. Just for fun, very recently, this document was discovered. It's a catalog of a vast library, and these are brief descriptions, and it's an amazing find, apparently. Since we're in the business of providing authoring and reading experiences, here is a mechanical version. It's a wheel where you can have multiple books open at the same time. You can, with hand crank, move from shelf to shelf. And this is an early example of a multi-window system where I can have multiple documents open at the same time and do alt tabs between them. Nothing new under the sun. And there's still literature being produced today in which you have this notion of the main text and then secondary and tertiary interpretations. David Foster Wallace does that, and you see he uses color coding. So I've mentioned Bush. Let's dive a little bit deeper into the Bush story. So I mentioned he was thinking about microfilm, but you'll notice there's a kind of interaction paradigm already. There's a hand, there's sketching, and the idea was that you wouldn't just read passively as we do with microfilm readers, but you'd constantly be adding information to what was already there. His big idea was that the human brain works by association. We don't do a sort of table lookup style of retrieval. We free associate, and things that belong together somehow get neurally wired to be together. And that's associative memory. It so turned out that I worked on an associative memory as part of my PhD dissertation. I used it for computer graphics. So this idea of association and building trails of related items via association was very comfortable to me. So I'll just let you read these quotes, and you see words like linking and trail, and those survive to this day. He predicted that we would create whole new forms of writing in which these trails would be dominant. Think Wikipedia as an example. And what he predicted that did not come true very much is that there would be lots of people blazing these trails. Some of us do, most of us don't. This was a vision piece. It was never implemented because the technology of the day wasn't up to it. The guy who implemented the vision was inspired by it and carried it forward is our hero, Doug Engelbart, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about him. How many have heard of Doug Engelbart? Too few. What did he invent? The mouse. Okay, now does that click? First use of the mouse. Yeah, forgive the pun. It's the least important of all the things that he thought about and invented. So I want to dive down a little into him because you have to know this system. We still today rely on the fundamental ideas that he promulgated 50 years ago. So the mother of all demos is called that. I coined that phrase because it was an incredible production. Think of it as a rock concert. There were dozens of people involved in doing it, 2 sites, the biggest projection screen I had ever seen, 20 foot by 10 foot, brand new technology. And here was this guy on stage doing all these things interactively with colleagues back at Menlo Park when he was in San Francisco. We were stunned. It was the most powerful demonstration of what you might think of as New World technology that any of us have ever seen, or I think will see. More money was spent on it than on all of the demos combined up to that point and far into the future. It was amazing that DARPA allowed it. So what did he show? He showed interactive authoring and reading experiences on the screen. You're going to see a lot of outline processing, and this is the best video available. It's not very good, but I think you'll get the general idea. Interactive authoring and exploration.
So look what else we can do in here. I've got this file that's structured. If I want to see what's in there, I can walk down the hierarchy levels and see, or return. But there's another thing I can do. There's a root I set I have here. So here, I'm afraid I'll need a different picture to view. So here's what I drew with a picture drawing capability here. It's a slight map if I start from work. And here's the route I seem to have to go to pick up all the materials. And that's my plan for getting home tonight. But if I want to, I can say, the library, what am I supposed to pick up there? I can just point to that. And oh, I see, overdue books and all. Well, there was a statement there with that name on it. Go back. What if what am I supposed to pick up at the drugstore? See, there's it. All right. Market? Oh, I've already seen that. Rather slow like that. Gee, that's too much.
Look at it online. It's still an amazing demo. And it's so smooth and seamless. It was really, really powerful. So hierarchy, statement numbering, he turned off the numbering in this demo. Hyperlinks, multiple windows. He was working with a colleague whose face we saw. They were chalk passing so that somebody was in control of the editing. Bimanual operations, still not something most of us do on a daily basis. He used a special keyboard, 5 buttons called the cord and the mouse. He typed very abbreviated commands. It wasn't a GUI in the modern sense. His links were not embedded as special things that you couldn't see. They were just ordinary strings, so you could copy them. That's the design that was then done for URLs. He invented it. It was an amazing collection of software engineering practices and techniques and tool building, specialized compilers for specialized interaction languages. I'd never seen anything like that either. And they dog food it. They practiced all this stuff on themselves. And this he saw as a tool for empowering his own group and other groups that were forming with the nascent ARPANET. And ultimately, what he really wanted to do is to have power tools for knowledge workers to make them more productive, raise their IQ, and ultimately raise society's IQ. At the end of the talk, I'll come back and reflect on how far along we are on his trajectory. Another inspiring visionary was my schoolmate from Swarthmore, Ted Nelson, who coined the word hypertext and tackled some of the knottiest issues on how we author and how we read these nonlinear texts, how we compensate authors for that work, and what the world of the future with ever cheaper computers would be like. On eBay, you can still get copies of these very nicely illustrated books, which are challenges to us to open up our eyes to things that can be done with computing. One of his phrases that I find memorable is, if computing is the wave of the future, displays are the surfboards. I thought that was wonderfully evocative. And I chance met him at a computer conference. He explained this hypertext idea to me. I told him I had, for the first time, a big graphics display from IBM. And he said, let's do an experiment on a hypertext system. So he commuted to Brown, and my team and I implemented the hypertext editing system. 1967 and 68, interactive authoring and editing on screens, kind of like Engelbart at the same time, and following links. We didn't have statement hierarchy, and I had that, put that in the next system, which was 1968. We've still been building hypermedia systems. I'd hoped to demonstrate our latest this morning, but as of last night, I felt performance wasn't good enough, so I'm going to skip it. In any case, these fundamental ideas that resonated so strongly with me in the very early days are still very much with me. Another pioneer who does not need introduction, but who made universal hypertext possible is Sir Tim. And we now have hypertext at scale, which is not something that Ted or Doug or I really thought about. We still thought about systems that would be on one or more computers, but we didn't imagine connecting the entire world. Maybe Doug and Ted did, but I sure didn't. Now, the problem with the World Wide Web is we have a very constrained notion of linking. They're unidirectional. There's not a lot of descriptive information and tagging that you can do with links, but they connect anything to anything else. The most important loss, I believe, is that we now mostly think in terms of this set of very few people does the authoring, the rest of us do passive reading, whereas all of us in the beginning had this notion that we would all be active author readers and no distinction in our expressive power with our tools. So as part of World Wide Web, again, this ancient notion, go back to the library at Alexandria, we want everything to be available via the internet, all of human knowledge, and we're still on that quest. Now, hyperlinks continue to be important, but I think to a large extent they've been replaced by real-time searching, which has been just incredible. The degree to which it scales, the notion that we can get sub-second response time. We didn't dream of this even when we are in science fiction mode in the 60s and 70s. It's truly marvelous. We did not anticipate how powerful machine learning would become, even though I worked on building a little perceptron in 1959. But the idea of millions of such units being wired together to do machine learning was not something we thought about. I think search is still primitive. You have to be quite literal about what you want, whereas most of the time I have a vague notion of what I want to search for. And all my experiments with so-called smart speakers, they're very dumb. They're very routinized. They can do standard requests, but as soon as you get into variations. Oh, so for example, Google Home has note-taking capability. I didn't want to have to go and Google to find out how to use it, so I asked my smart speaker, how do you take notes? And she said, the equivalent of, I've recorded your note. I said, hey, Google, how do I enter notes? I tried 14 different ways, none of them worked, I gave up. So I don't know how to use the note-taking that is clearly built in because natural language and some amount of inferencing still isn't there. It will come in time. Personal computing, a mad idea that all of us would own one or more computers. Look at the age of these kids. I mean, I would have said this is a 6th grader. Whoop. Over here. Okay, well, you all know enough about Bill Gates, and I'll tell you the culture in which this personal computing thing happened. As I mentioned, the late 60s were a very turbulent time in the US and elsewhere. And so we had two completely separate movements that kind of came together and in some ways influenced each other. You have the incredible engineering progress that gave us micro-miniaturization and computers on a chip, as opposed to computers filling a room this size and then more, and that we call now Moore's Law. But the social currents were anti-establishment, against the man. The Vietnam War was a tremendous issue at the time. And out of that came a kind of creative synthesis, which was a rebellion against big everything, including big computing, mainframe computing, which was dominated by IBM at the time. These were the original founders. There is Bill, and this is Bob Wallace, who learned on my hypermedia systems in the late 60s and then became one of the founders of Microsoft. This business of going against the man in computing is wonderfully illustrated by this absolute amazing, I have to get it here, advertisement. This ran once during the Super Bowl, but it's probably the most famous commercial in history.
On January 24th, Apple Computer will introduce Macintosh, and you'll see why 1984 won't be like 1984.
Isn't that amazing? So, Apple Computer and later IBM were rebelling against mainframe domination. And the whole Earth catalog, those of us who were of that generation will remember how influential this thinking was. It was back to nature, communes, and survivalism, not in the military sense at all. And Stuart Brand coined this phrase, which unfortunately, or fortunately, depending upon your point of view, still dominates our thinking today. Information should be free. We should have access to it. Yeah, very nice when it's provided, but I'll have a lot more to say about what it has led to in terms of monopoly power. So this is a brief review of a whole bunch of names that you should know. We've talked about Bush, Sutherland, and Engelbart. More time would have let me talk about the internet pioneers who started with ARPANET, Bob Taylor, who had the brilliant insight to think about the office of the future for a company that didn't understand, but they did. The person who brought us the multi-window interactive development environment writ large with bitmap graphics and object-oriented programming. And Smalltalk, Alan, Adele, who deserves much more mention than she's gotten, and a whole team. And that was an amazing environment. Of course, these people are known for their hardware and software, Bob Metcalf for Ethernet. The thing that brought personal computing into the world as more than it's a cool toy was VisiCalc, Excel today, and that really created an industry. This guy is unsung because he died prematurely in a plane crash, but he produced the PC, and we talked at length with him about Unix and direct manipulation GUIs and getting away from command languages. And if he had not died, I think IBM would be a very different company. And of course, everybody remembers the brilliant Steve. So, fourth vision, connect the world. I'll spend very little time on this except to criticize it at the end of my talk. A very good initial vision. And then Mark Weiser, another person who died prematurely. Ubicomp. What do we mean? Computing everywhere and with the devices knowing their place in the ecosystem. Carried quite a bit further by this pioneer who's been working on this quest for 30 years and emphasizes that we want to keep humans in the loop and that it has to be people-centered, not about devices and how they interconnect and play nicely together. Necessary, but not sufficient. And there have been many, many projects. I worked with a group of 4 other universities and an NSF Science and Technology Center for 11 years. This is a little cartoon illustration. We spent a lot of time on VR and thinking about how virtual environments and real environments could blend for collaboration. So this is the well-known Henry Fuchs in the foreground. He has spoken here. Most of you know him. Brilliant researcher. And that's the red-haired guy with glasses in the foreground. Elaine Cohen and Rich Riesenfeld from Utah in the back about going out, Albar at Caltech, and they're co-designing a new head mount display looking at the optical paths. And you can see there's a blend of the real offices and the virtual office created by the VR experience. And many other projects, smart home at universities and places like Microsoft. But to look at it, step back a little and be a little critical, that problem we started working on, we and many others, still isn't really well solved. Blending virtual and real is just intrinsically very hard. Now, ubicomp is a term, most of you have heard it? Hands? Okay, ubiquitous computing, you've heard that, right? Okay, just a few, I'm surprised. Ubiquitous computing, the idea is very simple, computing everywhere, right? Okay, well, Bill Buxton, another one of my heroes from whom I learn every time I read him or meet with him in person, says ubiquitous is the wrong word. It really should be ubiquitous, because ubiquity, you can look it up in the dictionary, emphasizes place in a metaphorical sense. Where you are, your context, your physical and social environment, and of course, your devices. So it takes into account way more than devices. Sociologists talk about the moral order. What is the behavior that is appropriate in a particular context? You can talk on your phone while you're in your office or in your car, but when you're sitting next to someone in an airplane, it's very rude to be talking on the telephone, particularly when you shout in the telephone because the connection isn't very good. So what is appropriate under what circumstances is all part of sense of place. So it's not just about the gadgets, it's about these complex relationships. Then you get a kind of graph that builds up out of capturing the context and the relationships. And I see it as a complexity management problem. So they did an early experiment under Mark Weiser's direction where they had large touch displays. They had little devices, this tab with a pen and some keys like the 3 valves on a trumpet. And you could walk around and it would know, it was an active badge where you were and who you were working with. And it was a really cool experiment. So ubiquitous computing is a term we should all use. And the notion is that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. And the parts are not just physical devices. It's we as the interacting agents and our contexts and our intents. Okay, I'm now gonna concentrate for a few minutes on my own focus area over, well, more than 5 decades. The sketchpad idea of having a really natural interaction style through devices of various kinds. So what should a UI do? It's a mediator. It goes between users and the entire ecosystem, and we want to manage the complexity. We've had some really good books. Our friend and colleague, Daniel Wigdor at U of Toronto, before that doing tablet and surface computing at Microsoft, my PhD student, now full professor at Florida, Joe Laviola and colleagues, 3D user interfaces. I'm hoping most of you are familiar with these seminal texts. So one could ask, all right, what are natural user interfaces? Well, the most natural is not to have an interface at all. They're getting in between you and what you want to get accomplished, so get rid of them. And then there are people who say, well, if you spend 10 years studying the violin, it's got a horrible user interface until you master it, and then it becomes the most natural way of expressing yourself musically and emotionally that you can imagine. The aesthetics are just right. You have to learn it. It's not immediately obvious. So I think neither extreme works for us in the computer world. We have to be somewhere in between. And what we want to do is to have good interaction style, where we can interact with our virtual objects, we can perform our tasks, and be able to interact with our collaborators while we do all this. So I'm very interested in how computer-based agents can help us do this. And my model here is a character out of a set of very formulaic stories that I just love by P.G. Wodehouse, where Jeeves is the perfect butler who knows all the idiosyncrasies of his master, Bertie, who is a upper-class twit in the classic British sense. That was wonderfully satirized by Monty Python. The butler knows everything and can anticipate and deals with Bertie's complete history and context, and has this eubiety, is able to know what Bertie wants to do before Bertie knows it. Of course, agents like that have to have natural language understanding and a very complete knowledge base. I want to show you one more video, which again is one of these things that has kind of fallen out of the modern computer culture, but it's still very instructive. It was commissioned by John Sculley when he was running Apple, and he wanted to find out how are people going to interact with computers in the future. He focused particularly on intelligent agents.
Surprise birthday party next Sunday.
Today you have a faculty lunch at 12 o'clock. You need to take Kathy to the airport by 2. You have a lecture at 4:15 on deforestation in the Amazon rainforest.
Right. Let me see the lecture notes from last semester.
Whoa. Something.
No, that's not enough. I need to review more recent literature. Pull up all the new articles I haven't read yet.
Journal articles only?
Fine.
Your friend...
Pull up all the new articles I haven't read yet. Know any agents that can do that for you today? And then listen closely to the dialogue.
Published an article about deforestation in the Amazon and its effects on rainfall in the sub-Sahara. It also covers drought's effect on food production in Africa and increasing imports of...
Contact Jill.
I'm sorry, she's not available right now. I left a message that you would call.
Okay. Let's see. There's an article about 5 years ago, Dr. Flemson or something. He really disagreed with the direction of Jill's research.
John Fleming of Uppsala University. He published in the Journal of Earth Science of July 20 of 2006.
Yes, that's it. He was challenging Jill's projection of the amount of carbon dioxide being released to the atmosphere through deforestation. I'd like to recheck his figures.
Here is the rate of deforestation he predicted.
And what happened?
Okay, I don't know why the video is having problems. It played fine during rehearsal.
It's really off.
Okay.
It's into university research and everything.
Can you imagine having even a human assistant who can do this for you? That's really hard. Yeah, but that's what we want, no doubt about it. Can't wait to get it. Of course, assistants can go a little off course, and you should all see it's an anniversary year of 2001. It's still a fabulous movie, even if you can't see it in the original widescreen Cinerama. It's slow paced, let me warn you about that, but it has amazing vision. So today, the best we can do is we can have interfaces where we don't have to think about what we're doing, a kind of transparency because we've minimized cognitive load. We're running an autopilot muscle memory, automagic. That's what we should aim for. In the future, brain-computer interfaces to minimize the notion of an interface today. That's very invasive. Actually implanting sensors in deep brain to pick up the very noisy signals from neurons, use neural nets to interpret them. Brown pioneered in this research 100 neurons, and people with locked-in syndrome who can't even twitch their eyebrows are able, by thinking about where a cursor should go in a menu, to activate that menu with choices. Amazing. It gives those people a chance finally to communicate. Of course, what we want is skull caps, and there are multiple attempts to try to read the very, very weak and noisy signals that emerge on our scalp. Very much still under development. What's wrong with WIMP GUIs? We all use them today. Well, they're made for this little cartoon figure on the right. That's not us. We want to make use of our full body sensorium. We want to use speech and gestures and use both our hands and our body, and the system is largely unaware in WIMP GUIs of who we are and where we are. What we're all interested in the I3D community is this other kind of post-WIMP interface, as I called it in the 90s already. Other people call it perceptual UIs, natural UIs, all the same thing. Multiple things happening in parallel, and that includes not just devices, but humans as well. Very high bandwidth as opposed to pressing down a single key on a keyboard. It's noisy, it's continuous, and speech and gesture are a perfect example. Just to tell you, nothing new under the sun once again. We had tablet computing in the mid-60s. We had touch computing in the mid-60s. We have better implementations today. All of this depends on probabilistic disambiguation and doing a kind of sensor fusion where we take multiple input channels and we do probabilistic determination of the most likely thing that has been recognized. And then we correlate what this channel is telling us with what this channel is telling us. And again, going back in history, very old idea. Most people have never heard of this project. And again, it was a vision project, and we still can't really do it today.
It's like we're back here in the Caribbean. Sure does, Eric. Let's put some ships in it. Let's give it a try.
Can we
pay attention?
Go ahead.
Create a red oil tanker.
Where?
Can we lower the volume?
There. Create a blue cruise ship.
Where?
There. Make a yellow sailboat.
What color?
Well,
Where?
north of Jamaica. Create a green freighter.
Where?
North of that. Let's try one together. Sure, let's try it. Clear. Clear.
Proceed.
Put that there. Protect that. Copy the cruise ship.
Eric, do we?
So frustrating. I don't know what's happening.
That's acceptable. Thank you.
Okay, he says, Eric, do you agree? The computer does. So the computer is monitoring the dialogue. By the way, this is all real. It was not mocked up like Knowledge Navigator. Of course, it was a demo. It was not robust, but still, this is working software in 1980 at what is now the MIT Media Lab, and then was the Architecture Machine Group. We've done a fair amount of work in this area. This is an example already from almost 20 years ago. where we're using a PDA to do navigation, and we're looking in active stereo glasses at a virtual reality recreation of the Martian surface and superimposing various kinds of visualization data and using voice control. So there are multiple people who work in this area, but there's still a lot to be done. A former student of mine in graphics just finished his PhD. They're doing it for human-robot interaction, where you're speaking and gesturing, like put that there, and you're doing belief networks based on a kind of Markov model called POMDPs that they really like. So let's pull back a little and start talking about all this technology. Fine. How do we synthesize and get something we really want? As per Buxton's exhortations, we want ubiity, not just ubiquity. And that means we want to be able to switch very agilely between our devices based on our context. And sometimes we need to be multi-threaded. I usually think about 2 or 3 things I have to get done at the same time, often in the shower. I can't really have an intelligent agent work with me, and then when I move to the sink to shave and do all those things, I'd like to have a display and be able to gesture and keep my multiple thoughts going. While I'm driving, I want the damn system to read my email to me, not just linearly, but based on importance, based on urgency, based on a bunch of criteria, and know when I'm in a situation where I can't be distracted, because the car has that kind of sensing ability. So why shouldn't it adapt to the current driving conditions, and so on and so on and so on. We're very far from doing that. And yeah, direct manipulation is wonderful, but it's really primitive. I'd much rather be at a higher level of abstraction. As I used to tell my kids, hey, we got guests coming for dinner, set the table, please. Well, they inferred from my explaining who the guests were, what kind of stuff should be set on the table, conferred with my wife about what she was cooking, and intelligently set the table. I didn't have to direct manipulate, pull dishes out of the cupboard. It was done for me. We're very far away from that still. We have some simple forms of collaboration. And as hard as autonomous vehicles are, I think that's an easy, constrained problem that doesn't require the vast amount of human knowledge that we have to have for good collaborative work with computers. And remind yourselves, when we say computers, we're no longer just talking about the single smartphone dangling of our bags, of our belts, or in our handbags. We're going to be instrumented. We're going to have devices in us and all around us. How do we get focused and yet have some sense of the periphery so that we have situational awareness? How do we manage level of detail? This is the community that knows about stuff like that. And notice that when the intelligent agent was working with our mock-up professor, the agent was summarizing the content of articles. That's still an unsolved problem, but we're getting there. Also was able to make inferences, had an idea of what might be valuable to the partner. So, stepping back yet a little more, zooming out a little as it were, let's look at where we are today in terms of these early visions of what we want. We have terrific accessibility, and to a first order approximation, information at your fingertips is a solved problem. We have good tool suites. Yes, they have their problems, but they're pretty usable. But the information explosion that Bush already wrote about in 1945 is still overwhelming us. And the trouble today is that most of the information out there is uncurated. We don't know the sources. We don't know the provenance. How trustworthy is that data? And an ideal that we all wanted, we want everybody to be authors and readers and be able to publish online. Wow, that has gone really off the rails in so many ways that we did not foresee. I wanted to build tools to help journalists and editors, not kick them out of their jobs. And what we have now is people blogging, and we no longer have people who've been trained to be journalists and to the right kind of fact checking. Newsrooms are dying all over. I worry that our town's only paper, we have 1 million people in our state, that we're going to be without a paper, as many places are now, because of our tech. Our tech is fantastic. The scaling is unbelievable. Yes, we can connect the world. Yeah, except for China and Russia that have plans to go and build their firewalls. We have increasing cyber everything. I don't need to belabor that. I want to point out that this beautiful environment of small talk that Alan and his team created, we don't have it. We have silos. It is so bloody difficult to connect things today and to make them interoperate because they were built in silos by small groups and companies that don't make their money out of interoperation. So do we have ubiquitous computing? I claim not. Even smart homes, which seems a relatively more constrained problem. Sensors and cameras, link them together, find out what they're forming. Well, Google just bought Nest, and all of the plans of Nest are discontinued. So all those people who invested in their smart homes are basically SOL at this point. And there have been any number of stories about breaches in that ecosystem. What about user interfaces? Voice and gesture still wholly inadequate. I spend way too much time correcting my dictation. It's amazing to me. It's pretty good, it's usable, but I still know lots of people who thumb type on their smartphones, and I say, why don't you use dictation? And they say, I spend too much time correcting the dictation, so I might as well thumb type. That's unacceptable. In our ecosystem, lots of us working on VR, we still have a ways to go. I learned from Morgan that they're going to present a new system at SIGGRAPH. Can't wait to see it, which will be more comfortable and have really good tracking. I myself like autostereoscopic displays. A great research problem that I articulated 20 years ago, still unsolved, distributed haptic feedback that lets me have mobility. It's very hard. And our overall ecosystem, to me, is becoming increasingly unusable. I've given up going to the App Store. There's just too much stuff there. And I now rely on my friends saying, hey, have you checked out such and such an app? We don't have good multimodal interaction yet. We can piece it together out of component technologies. And we have really terrible failures of UI, control software, and so on. And there are real questions now about this original vision dating from the 50s and 60s of human-in-the-loop computing, whether that has a proper future or whether the devices are going to be all fly-by-wire and be misprogrammed or mismanaged. And that's a developing set of issues. Okay, let's finish this now by my talking about societal implications, which has really concerned me for quite a while. I have a segment in my course where every day's lecture, I start off with 2-3 minutes about what I call IT in the news. And I've talked a lot about cybercrime and data breaches and autonomous vehicles, highlighting both the incredible technological achievements, AlphaGo, for example, but also the downsides, potential and real. In my graphics course, we talk about photography and how deep fakes are done. And what I now want to concentrate on is the role of social media, which I think increasingly, to paraphrase Etzker Dijkstra, social media considered harmful. The original title of his article was The Go-To Considered Harmful. I think social media are a real problem, and I'm gonna pound on that for a little bit. So Buxton, in his talks, talked about Kranzberg's first law: technology is neither good nor bad, but it's not neutral. We have to think about the side effects. And I was, and still am, a techno-optimist, and I concentrate on making the tech better, making people more productive and happier. And the social implications, well, that was somebody else's job. And that is a great reminder of Harvard's best-known mathematician, who stopped doing mathematics and became a cabaret artist, Tom Lehrer. Anybody ever heard of Tom Lehrer? Oh, good. So he was a satirist, and this is Werner von Braun's song, and well, just listen to the lyrics.
Gather round while I sing you of Werner von Braun, a man whose allegiance is ruled by expedience. Call him a Nazi, he won't even frown. Nazi. He says Werner von Braun.
Nazi schmatzi was the line.
Don't say that he's hypocritical. Say rather that he's apolitical. Once the rockets are up, who cares where they come down? That's not my department, says Werner von Braun.
So that's kind of how I feel our techno-society is operated. Where they come down is not our problem. And I'm finishing up my keynote by doing a little bit of proselytizing for having much more concern about social responsibility. I want to tell you, I'm a hardcore capitalist. I've been part of 20 startups. I love the startup culture. So don't think of me as a socialist, but I am for responsible capitalism that does deal with social impact. And I'm going to talk about some of these, having been heavily influenced, not just by what I've seen around me, by these tomes. I'll leave them here so you can look at them during the break. And together they make a very compelling case that we're in deep doo-doo and we need to do something about it, that we can't just ignore it. It all stems from the fact that Stewart Brand said information wants to be free. And we adopted that mantra. We want our stuff to be free. Okay, so we have a little data privacy problem. Now and then we have some data breaches and we have to go to Equifax and deal with it. Okay, still free is so nice. But what's really happening is that has come at a tremendous cost to us, which translates to tremendous rewards for the company who uses what Zuboff calls surveillance capitalism. The scale at which social media operate is beyond belief. It's billions of people. And so if you have an effect, it gets multiplied. Here are the 4 topics I'm going to very briefly address, since I'm gonna, oh geez, I'm already out of time. Okay, addiction, screen addiction. You've heard of this. We used to talk about time on task and task performance, and that was good stuff. And then we ramped it up a notch and talked about engagement and stickiness. But what it really is all about ultimately is vendor lock-in and getting more revenue for ads. And addiction, a brilliant TED talk from Tristan Harris about mind control, basically. How is addiction fostered? Well, it's based on hardcore research, psychology research, from gambling and game industries in particular, a toxic mix of what our brains do when they are properly stimulated via algorithms. And it comes from behaviorism, starting with Pavlov, Skinner, positive and negative reinforcement and all that stuff. There's this very influential lab, and here's some of the ways in which we all get hooked. Bright colors, high energy sound. Dopamine is what it's all about. We have drugs that do things to our dopamine levels. These are visual drugs. We used to love the idea of affinity groups. The quilters can get together. I'm into mountain biking, love being on a mountain bike site. But what we really have now is a fostering of addiction. For example, when you start watching a YouTube video, already the next one is queued up. It's a feature, it's a bug. It's both, of course. All of us have FOMA to a degree. Kids especially live in a world saturated with social insecurity and the need for approval. So if we have systems that foster getting approval, that is addictive as hell. And kids feel guilty. Adults feel guilty when they don't respond in what they think is an adequate time to what their friends are saying. Articles, streaks. How many of you knew about streaks? Wow, see, I didn't either. Just learned about this stuff. Snapchat has this system where you get rewards if you keep messaging with somebody, sending them anything. Doesn't matter what you send them. So the idea is you keep interacting with your peer group, and those are called streaks, and it's very addictive. Well, your data is being hoovered up and merchandised, and the social graph of you is beyond anything you know. It's beyond what I knew. It's incredible how much data has been hoovered up by our online behavior. And it's not just what Facebook learns when we are on Facebook, it's what is hoovered up from all the other things we are doing. And what's going on, and I guess I'm going to have to stop here since I'm already scandalously over time. I'll stop after this. It's not just about modeling behavior, it's about getting us to change our behavior, and that's a very old art. I didn't know, but Freud's nephew wrote the classic book on propaganda and how to influence people. In college, I read The Hidden Persuaders, 57, which talked about how we are being manipulated, behavior modification. And we now have a news center. Then you can say, I'm not susceptible to ads. Well, that might have been true for television ads, but it's not true for what happens in your online behavior of micro-targeting. Micro-targeting filter bubbles. Our worst impulses are gathered and magnified, and we get the echo chamber. And what's really disgusting, and this has been proven over and over again, that people harden their positions when they are presented with contradictory information. So we now live in the post-truth world of alternative facts. I hope that will change with a change in government, but it's being embedded in our culture. And if you say things long enough and loud enough, the big lie or agitprop, people start believing it, and our fake news is generated not just by people spreading it, but by bots and algorithms and unwilling dupes. Fake news is a terrible problem, and so we have hacking, and it causes deaths. The number of deaths in Myanmar, Sri Lanka, caused by fake information spread by the social media. The anti-vax problem right now, this is a serious problem in the US. Measles and whooping cough, which were wiped out, are coming back. And there are places now that have to be quarantined. This is having major impact. So we get tribalism, divisiveness, and the center is being hollowed out. Okay, this is all because of the economic model. This scholarly tome by a former chair at the Harvard Business School lays out the case in great detail. It's based on a kind of strand of laissez-faire economics, libertarianism, and the devil take the hindmost, or social Darwinism. So they created a Frankenstein, or in earlier literature, the golem, an artificial man that wreaked havoc on the population. But it works for them because it creates enormous wealth, growth and wealth. We have an unregulated monopoly. We have Zuck, controls Facebook, 2.7 billion users. His policies have more effect than the policies of the President of the United States. Who the hell appointed him czar about what should be published on this publication medium? And these social media are not content neutral platform, folks. That's a lie they like to promulgate. They are content providers, and their news feeds in particular have been terribly influential in creating the culture that we all have to live in today. So they delay, deny, and deflect to say it's not our problem, rather than really working together. So the government does have to step in, and I'm glad to see GDPR. I can't say I've digested it. I'm not an expert in this area, but it's a good first step, and more has to happen. We also have to upscale our concerns about how we build human-computer interaction. You have to take into account not just whether the interface is going to be pleasant to use and productive in sort of classical task performance terms, but you have to ask, will this promote the social good? What are the unexpected consequences and side effects? And here's a center, the Center for Humane Computing, that Tristan set up, that is making a start. I want to finish up by saying the folks who are concerned not about social media, but about AI are really a good bellwether. And I'm just going to flip through a number of efforts. I'm going to make my slides available so you can follow these leads. There's a partnership on AI which has dozens and dozens of organizations, including not just companies like Accenture and Amazon and Facebook and Google and IBM and Microsoft, but also BBC and a variety of other outfits. And they want to look at how AI can be used for the common good and how some of these negative consequences can be somewhat ameliorated. Here are some other ones. I talked to Eric Horvitz at Microsoft a couple of days ago. The 100-year study is something he and his wife funded. It puts out a report every 5 years to talk about this set of issues. How do we make AI beneficial to society? And Microsoft has really taken a tremendous leadership position. I'm not saying they are unique, I just know more about what they are doing. And here's some publicly available links that tell you about how serious they are about ethical design. They have a so-called golden rule: fairness, reliability, privacy and security, inclusion, transparency, accountability, and user control. We're starting to be concerned about this in academia. Here are some leads to that. Ethics is now starting to become part of computer science curricula, maybe a little unit in each course. For example, I talk about photography and deep fakes and the use of visual truth, as it were. It doesn't exist anymore in my graphics course. And you can do a little bit of that in every course. And Brown has just appointed 10 undergraduate TAs to work with faculty on how we embed a little consciousness of ethics and societal implications in each and every course. Here's what I want all of us to do. It's a short list, and I don't have time to talk about it. I think you can read it. The last point I want to emphasize: My students all want to work at Facebook and Google and places like that, and I don't try to dissuade them. I just say, look, you're going to have projects where you may say, I don't know what the social impact of that's going to be. Think of the example of people who said, we're not going to work on facial recognition that's going to be sold to police departments or to the military. And you have that choice. Do I want to work on this project or not? Do I want to work on aspects that I think will be largely positive or not? All of us can make choices like that. Finishing, now I really am finished. So Engelbart wanted to lift the IQ of society as a whole. And I say, we're halfway there. Even the tech hasn't come along as far as we thought. If you look at 2001, it's a lot of interaction that we still can't do today. So have we augmented human intellect? That's what he called his movement. It's still being carried on by his daughter, Christina, in the Engelbart Institute. Have we raised our societal IQ? No. I think in many ways we're going backwards, but it's partially under our control. We can be great technologists, but we can have this lens, this optics of let's build tech that we can use in socially responsible ways. We are still only at the beginning of our technology revolution, and we do have a chance to talk about how we can influence it in positive ways. Thank you for letting me run over. I apologize. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.